In September 1848, a man stood on the auction block outside Delaware's old state house in Dover. He wore the clothing of a free man, but the crowd gathered around him that day saw him as property. His name was Samuel Burris. He was 50 years old, a teacher, a husband, a father of 6 children. And, under the laws of Delaware, he was about to be sold into slavery for the crime of helping other human beings escape bondage. As the auctioneer called out bids and traders examined him like livestock, Burris had no way of knowing that among the crowd stood a man who'd traveled from Wilmington with $500 in abolitionist gold, ready to risk everything to save him. Samuel Burris was born on October 14, 1813, in Willow Grove, a rural community in Kent County, Delaware. This detail alone made him extraordinary for his time. He was born free. His parents, George and Mary Burris, were both free black people who owned property in the area. In an America where millions of African Americans lived in chains, where slavery was the foundation of the Southern economy and the defining moral crisis of the nation, the Burris family represented something remarkable. They were free, they were property owners, and they were determined that their children would have opportunities. Delaware occupied a peculiar position in the geography of American slavery. It was a slave state, yes, but one where the enslaved population was actually outnumbered by free black residents. By 1840, Delaware had roughly 16,900 free black people compared to only about 2,600 enslaved individuals. This demographic reality didn't translate into freedom or equality. Instead, it created a powder keg of racial anxiety among white Delawareans, who responded with increasingly draconian laws designed to control and restrict the state's free black population. Samuel Burris grew up in this atmosphere of mounting oppression. His parents ensured he received an education, something increasingly rare and dangerous for black children in Delaware. He learned to read and write with eloquence. Historical records describe him as well-educated and articulate, a man who could speak and write with power and precision. These weren't just personal accomplishments. In a society that criminalized black literacy, that understood education as a threat to the racial hierarchy, Burris's education was itself an act of resistance. By the 1830s, Burris was working as a laborer, a farmer, and eventually as a teacher. He married a woman named Catherine, and together they built a life. Between 1835 and 1846, they had 6 children: James, George, Mary, Sarah, Eliza, and Samuel. 6 children growing up in a state that was systematically stripping away the rights of people who looked like them. Delaware's free black population faced an escalating assault on their basic freedoms during these years, a legislative campaign that laid bare the state's priorities. In 1807, Delaware passed a law prohibiting black residents from returning to the state if they'd been gone for more than 2 years. This waiting period was repeatedly shortened. 2 years became 6 months. 6 months became 6 weeks. By 1863, the threshold had been reduced to 5 days. 5 days. If a free black Delawarean left the state for less than a week, they could be permanently barred from returning home. It was exile by bureaucracy, separation by statute. In 1825, Delaware made it illegal for black people to come within half a mile of a polling place on Election Day. They'd already been denied the vote, but this law went further, criminalizing their very presence near the democratic process. In 1832, free black Delawareans lost the right to assemble and the right to bear arms, direct violations of the First and Second Amendments that white Americans took for granted. These weren't just inconveniences. They were systematic attacks designed to make free black life untenable, to encourage emigration, to ensure that freedom in Delaware meant something far less than freedom elsewhere. Burris understood what these laws meant. He understood that his children were growing up in a place that saw their very existence as a threat. And he understood something else too. Just across Delaware's northern border lay Pennsylvania, a free state where slavery had been abolished, where the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society operated openly, where men and women dedicated their lives to helping enslaved people escape to freedom. The border was close enough to give hope, close enough to be dangerous. In 1843, Burris subscribed to the National Anti-Slavery Standard, an abolitionist newspaper published in New York. This subscription was more than keeping informed. It was a declaration, a way of saying that he stood with those fighting slavery. By the mid-1840s, Burris had moved his family to Philadelphia, settling them in the relative safety of Pennsylvania while he continued to work as a teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. The move was strategic. Philadelphia was the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, the nerve center of underground railroad operations in the region. And Samuel Burris was about to become one of its most active agents. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad. There were no tracks, no schedules, no stations in any conventional sense. It was a network, a conspiracy of conscience, a web of safe houses and secret routes that stretched across the American landscape. Conductors guided freedom seekers along dangerous paths. Station masters provided shelter and supplies, and the whole operation ran on courage, careful planning, and the willingness to break laws that many Americans considered profoundly unjust. Burris became a conductor. He joined the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and began making trips into Delaware and Maryland, slave states where his presence as a black man helping enslaved people escape could result in his own enslavement. He worked closely with two white Quaker abolitionists, Thomas Garrett and John Hunn. Garrett operated what was essentially the last underground railroad station in Delaware, a final checkpoint before freedom seekers crossed into Pennsylvania. John Hunn was a farmer in Middletown, Delaware, whose property served as a crucial way station. Both men would pay terrible prices for their commitment to the cause. One of Burris's documented missions involved the Hawkins family. Samuel and Emmeline Hawkins were enslaved in Queen Anne's County, Maryland, a farming region on the eastern shore where slavery was deeply entrenched. The Hawkinses had children. They had dreams of freedom. And somehow, word reached them that there were people who could help. Burris traveled to Maryland and made contact with the family. He guided them and 4 other men north through the dangerous countryside toward John Hunn's farm. But someone noticed. A neighbor of Hunn's became suspicious of the group and alerted authorities. The Hawkins family was arrested before they could escape, separated from Burris and the 4 men who managed to continue on to Thomas Garrett's house in Wilmington. The Hawkins family was imprisoned in the New Castle jail, and for a time it seemed their bid for freedom had ended in disaster. This is where the network proved its worth. Thomas Garrett, a man of considerable courage and resources, hired a lawyer. He intervened with Chief Justice James Booth, Jr., and somehow, against all odds, the Hawkins family was freed in the New Castle courthouse. Garrett arranged for a wagon to take them to his home, where they were reunited with Samuel Burris and the rest of their group. Eventually, the Hawkins family made it to Byberry Township in Pennsylvania to freedom. They'd escaped, but the price of their escape would soon come due. Federal charges were brought against John Hunn and Thomas Garrett for violating the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, a law that made it a crime to assist enslaved people in escaping. The case was heard before Chief Justice Roger Taney, the same man who would later write the infamous Dred Scott decision declaring that black people had no rights, white people were bound to respect. Taney levied crushing fines against both men. John Hunn was financially ruined. Thomas Garrett lost nearly everything he owned. But both men continued their work on the Underground Railroad afterward, undeterred by bankruptcy and legal threats. Samuel Burris avoided prosecution in the Hawkins case, but his luck wouldn't hold. Delaware authorities knew who he was. They knew what he was doing, and they were determined to stop him. Burris himself understood the stakes. He once wrote that helping enslaved people gain freedom in Delaware was considered a crime nearly as serious as murder if committed by a black man. The punishment was specific and brutal. A black person convicted of aiding escaping enslaved people could be fined $500, imprisoned, and then sold into servitude for 7 years. White people faced fines and jail time, but not slavery. The law itself was structured around race, designed to terrorize black people who might dare to help others escape bondage. In January 1847, Burris attempted to help a woman named Maria Matthews escape from Dover Hundred in Kent County. The plan was to get her to Short's Landing, a point where Duck Creek met the Delaware River, where a steamship could carry her north to freedom. Something went wrong. Matthews was captured at the landing and re-enslaved, and a stagecoach driver testified that he'd seen Samuel Burris meeting with Matthews at Short's Landing. Burris was arrested. While he sat in the Dover jail awaiting trial, 2 enslavers from Murder Kill Hundred came forward with additional accusations. They claimed Burris had helped people they enslaved to escape. The wheels of Delaware justice began to turn. Burris sat in that jail cell for 14 months, over a year of his life spent locked away, knowing that when his trial ended, he could face something worse than prison. He could face the auction block. But Samuel Burris didn't spend those 14 months passively. He wrote letters, lots of letters. He wrote to his family, to his friends, to influential figures in the abolitionist movement. He wrote to anyone who might help. One of his letters was published in The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper. In it, Burris described his situation with remarkable clarity and courage. He knew he was facing a grotesque injustice, and he wanted the world to know. In November 1847, Samuel Burris was convicted. The court acquitted him of helping Maria Matthews, but found him guilty in the other 2 cases. The sentence was devastating. He was ordered to pay a $500 fine plus court costs. He was sentenced to 14 months imprisonment. And, after serving that sentence, he was to be sold twice for a total of 14 years of servitude. Samuel Burris, a free man who had been born free, who'd worked hard all his life, who'd committed no crime except the crime of believing that other human beings deserved freedom, was going to be sold into slavery. News of Burris's conviction reached Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society went into action. These weren't people who gave speeches and wrote pamphlets and left it at that. They were operatives, strategists, people willing to take risks and break laws when necessary. And they weren't going to let Samuel Burris be sold south without a fight. The plan they devised was audacious. They would send someone to the auction with enough money to buy Burris. They'd outbid the slave traders, purchase Burris with abolitionist funds, and then set him free. It sounds simple in retrospect, but the risks were enormous. If the plan failed, If their agent was recognized, if something went wrong, they could all end up in jail. They needed someone who wouldn't be recognized in Dover, someone who could convincingly play the part of a slave trader, someone with steady nerves and the courage to see it through. They chose Isaac Flint, a Quaker abolitionist from Wilmington. Flint was born in New York in 1819, had moved to the area as a young man, and had worked as a teacher for black children in Delaware. He was committed to the cause, and he had one crucial advantage. He wasn't well known in Dover. He could pass as an outsider, a visiting trader looking for property. In September 1848, Isaac Flint traveled to Dover with $500, the exact amount of Burris's fine. The money had been raised by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society through donations from abolitionists across the region. Flint walked to the old state house where Samuel Burris would be auctioned on the front steps. He had to blend in with the traders, had to act the part convincingly enough that no one would suspect his true purpose. The scene that unfolded that day was obscene. Samuel Burris, a man who'd lived 5 decades as a free person, was placed on an auction block and examined like livestock. Traders inspected him from head to toe, checking his teeth, his muscles, his body for signs of disease or weakness. It was degrading, dehumanizing, the logical endpoint of a system that treated human beings as property. And Isaac Flint, playing his role, examined Burris along with the rest of them. He couldn't let anyone see his disgust, couldn't let his true feelings show. The bidding began. The auctioneer called out amounts. Traders raised their paddles. A Baltimore trader got heavily involved, driving the price up. The bids reached $500, and the Baltimore trader was in the lead. This is where accounts get interesting. According to some sources, Flint bribed the Baltimore trader, paying him an additional $100 to drop out of the bidding. Other accounts suggest Flint simply outbid him. Either way, when the hammer fell, Isaac Flint was the winning bidder. Samuel Burris had been sold to a man he'd never seen before. The bill of sale was completed. Flint legally owned Samuel Burris. And then, once they were a safe distance from the auction block, once they were away from the crowd, Isaac Flint leaned close to Samuel Burris and whispered words that must have felt like a miracle. He told Burris not to fear. He told him he'd been purchased with abolitionist gold. He told him he was going to Philadelphia, back to his wife and children and friends. He told him he was free. The relief Burris must have felt is hard to imagine. He'd spent over a year in jail knowing this auction was coming, knowing he was likely to be sold south, knowing he might never see his family again. And then, at the last possible moment, his friends in the movement had saved him. They had literally bought his freedom. It cost them nearly $20,000 in today's money, but they had done it. Samuel Burris was reunited with his family in Philadelphia as a free man. You'd think that would be the end of the story. You'd think that after such a close call, after coming within moments of being enslaved, Burris would quit the Underground Railroad, would count his blessings, and live quietly. But that's not what happened. Samuel Burris went right back to work. Newspaper reports from late 1848 place him giving speeches in Wilmington and Dover. The Blue Hen's Chicken, a local Delaware newspaper, reported that Burris had speaking engagements in both cities. He was openly advocating for abolition, openly challenging the system that had just tried to enslave him. And the authorities noticed. In February 1849, just months after the auction, 29 residents of the Camden area sent a petition to the Delaware General Assembly, specifically naming Samuel Burris. They complained that he was going about the county persuading and enticing enslaved people to run away. They noted that he had been tried, convicted, and sold, but that the men who bought him had let him go and he'd continued his work. They demanded that the legislature pass a new law to stop him. Delaware responded with a law targeting Burris by name. The legislation stated that if he continued helping enslaved people escape, he could face 60 lashes in addition to being sold into slavery. 60 lashes. Anyone familiar with the brutality of slavery knows what that means. 60 lashes could kill a person. It was essentially a death sentence wrapped in legal language. Even Samuel Burris, who had shown remarkable courage throughout his life, recognized that he couldn't operate under those conditions. The risks had become too great, not just for him, but for his family. His wife Catherine and their 6 children had already endured his 14-month imprisonment, had already lived through the horror of his near enslavement. He couldn't ask them to go through it again, but Burris didn't stop his abolitionist work entirely. He continued to serve on the business committee of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society into the early 1850s. He stayed in contact with William Still, the chairman of the Society's Vigilance Committee and one of the most important figures in Underground Railroad history. Still kept meticulous records of every freedom seeker who passed through Philadelphia, documenting their names, their stories, their journeys from slavery to freedom. After the Civil War, Still published these records in his 1872 book, The Underground Railroad, creating an invaluable historical record. And in those pages he documented Samuel Burris's role in the network, ensuring that Burris's courage wouldn't be forgotten. In 1852, Samuel Burris made a significant decision. His older brothers had moved to California, seeking better economic opportunities in a state that had just been admitted to the Union as free territory. California's admission as a free state in 1850 had been part of the Compromise of 1850, that last desperate attempt to hold the nation together as it split apart over slavery. And for free black people in the East, California represented possibility. It was far from the slave states, far from the legal structures that made life so precarious in places like Delaware. Burris moved to San Francisco first, establishing himself there before his family joined him. It was a long journey, probably by ship around Cape Horn or across the Isthmus of Panama, months of travel to reach the Pacific coast. But once there, Burris didn't abandon the cause that had nearly cost him everything. He continued working for freedom, just in different ways. In California, Burris became active in the state's free black community. He signed petitions regarding African American rights in California. He worked through black churches to raise funds, collecting money that would be sent east to help freedom seekers. And when the Civil War finally came in 1861, when the issue of slavery exploded into open warfare, Samuel Burris was among the first in San Francisco to organize fundraising for refugees from slavery. As the Union Army advanced through the South, hundreds and then thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines, seeking freedom under the protection of federal troops. These refugees, called contrabands by the government, often arrived in Washington, D.C. and other cities with nothing. They needed food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and Samuel Burris, thousands of miles away in California, organized black churches to collect money to help them. He'd been doing this work for decades by then, had been helping people escape slavery since the 1840s. The war just made the work more urgent, the needs more visible. Samuel Burris lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln declared that all enslaved people in states under rebellion were free. It wasn't complete abolition, wasn't everything abolitionists had fought for, but it was a turning point. It made the Civil War officially a war to end slavery. And men like Samuel Burris, who'd risked everything for decades to help individuals escape bondage, could see that the entire institution was finally under siege. But Burris didn't live to see the end. He died in San Francisco on December 3, 1863, at the age of 50. The Pacific Appeal, a black newspaper in San Francisco, published his death notice. He was buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery in San Francisco, though his remains were later moved to Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Colma, when San Francisco's burial grounds were relocated in the early 20th century. His wife, Catherine, lived another 6 years, dying in San Francisco in September 1869 at the age of 55. Samuel Burris never saw the 13th Amendment, never saw slavery officially abolished across the entire United States. He died with the war still raging, with the outcome still uncertain. But he died knowing that the cause he'd devoted his life to was finally winning. For over a century, Samuel Burris's story remained relatively obscure. His name appeared in William Still's book, appeared in historical records of the Underground Railroad, but he wasn't widely known outside academic circles and local Delaware history. That began to change in the 1990s, when researchers at the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs started seriously investigating the state's African American history and its role in the Underground Railroad. Historians like Madeline Dunn, Beverly Laying, Cindy Snyder, and Gloria Henry spent years researching Burris's life, piecing together the documentary evidence, understanding his role in the broader story of resistance to slavery. Their work brought Burris's story back into public consciousness and eventually led to something remarkable. On November 2, 2015, exactly 168 years after Samuel Burris's conviction, Delaware Governor Jack Markell issued a posthumous pardon. The ceremony took place in the old State House in Dover, in the very courtroom where Burris had been tried and convicted, on the same day but a century and a half later. Several of Burris's descendants attended the ceremony, including a woman named Osha Thomas, who'd been instrumental in keeping her ancestors' story alive. At the ceremony, Osha Thomas read from a letter Samuel Burris had written to his brother from his jail cell in March 1848. In that letter, written while awaiting the auction that would determine his fate, Burris had written something profound. He acknowledged that slave traders were doing what Delaware law considered lawful business, that the state encouraged and protected them. And then he wrote this: "Yet I cannot forbear taking all opportunities to express great abhorrence of servitude and my passion for liberty upon any terms whatsoever." That passion for liberty. That willingness to express abhorrence of servitude even while imprisoned, even while facing the auction block. That's who Samuel Burris was, and Governor Markell's pardon recognized that. The pardon stated that while we cannot change what was done more than a century and a half ago, we can ensure that history no longer records Burris's actions as criminal, but as acts of freedom and bravery in the face of injustice. A historical marker was placed on Willow Grove Road near where Burris had grown up, part of the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad byway that traces the routes freedom seekers took through Maryland and Delaware. There's a plaque at Peter Spencer Plaza in Wilmington honoring his role in the Underground Railroad. And at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Colma, California, there's now a memorial recognizing the man buried there as an Underground Railroad hero. Samuel Burris's story matters for reasons that extend far beyond one man's courage. It illustrates the complexity of the border between slavery and freedom in antebellum America. Delaware was a slave state, yes, but one where the majority of black residents were free. This demographic reality created unique conditions. The state had a large Quaker population with abolitionist sympathies. It had men like Thomas Garrett willing to sacrifice their fortunes to help enslaved people escape. But it also had white residents terrified of free black people, determined to control and restrict them through increasingly harsh laws. Burris's story also reveals something crucial about the Underground Railroad itself. We often imagine the Underground Railroad as white abolitionists helping passive enslaved people escape to freedom. The reality was far more complex. Free black people like Samuel Burris, Harriet Tubman, and William Still were the backbone of the network. They took enormous risks, often greater risks than their white allies, because the penalties for black people helping enslaved individuals escape were far more severe. When Thomas Garrett and John Hunn were caught helping the Hawkins family, they faced financial ruin. Devastating, certainly, but they weren't in danger of being enslaved themselves. When Samuel Burris was caught, he faced 14 years of enslavement. The law made explicit distinctions based on race, structured punishment to terrorize black people specifically. And yet people like Burris kept working, kept risking everything, because they understood that freedom was worth any risk. There's something else worth considering about Burris's story. He was a teacher. Throughout his life, from his time in Delaware to his work in California, education mattered to him. This wasn't incidental. In a society that criminalized black literacy, that understood education as dangerous to the social order, teaching was itself revolutionary. Every enslaved person who learned to read could forge free papers. Every child who learned to write could document the truth about slavery. Every black person who became educated challenged the racist assumptions that justified bondage. And when Burris moved to California, when he worked through black churches to raise funds for refugees from slavery, he emphasized education. He wanted newly freed people to have access to schools, to job training, to the tools they'd need to build lives in freedom. He understood that escape from slavery was just the beginning. Building a life, building a community required resources, education, opportunity. The fact that Burris was born free but nearly enslaved also reveals the precariousness of freedom for black Americans in the antebellum period. Freedom wasn't secure. It wasn't guaranteed. Laws could change overnight. A wrong word to the wrong person could result in arrest. And for people convicted of helping others escape slavery, freedom could be legally stripped away. The auction block awaited even free black people who dared to challenge the institution of slavery. This precariousness didn't end with the Civil War and emancipation. The legal structures that could strip black people of their freedom, the laws that criminalized black life, the systems that treated black people as fundamentally different and less deserving of rights, all of that persisted long after slavery ended. It morphed into Jim Crow, into convict leasing, into mass incarceration, into 1,000 different mechanisms for controlling and exploiting black people. Understanding Samuel Burris's story means understanding that the freedom he fought for remains contested, remains something that requires constant defense. His story also challenges us to think about what we'd do in similar circumstances. It's easy to look back at slavery and say, we'd have been abolitionists, we'd have helped people escape, we'd have been on the right side of history. But Samuel Burris didn't live in hindsight. He lived in a world where helping enslaved people escape was illegal, where he faced prison and enslavement for his actions, where his family suffered for his choices. He had every reason to protect himself, to stay safe, to prioritize his own freedom over helping strangers. But he didn't. He kept making trips into slave territory. He kept guiding people to freedom. He kept writing letters even from jail, kept giving speeches even after his near enslavement, kept working for the cause even from California when he could have just lived quietly. That kind of sustained courage, that commitment to justice even at enormous personal cost, that's what genuine moral courage looks like. And it's vanishingly rare. When Delaware Governor Jack Markell pardoned Samuel Burris in 2015, he said something important. He said, "We can't change what happened over a century and a half ago." The injustice of Burris's conviction and near enslavement stands in the historical record, but we can change how we remember it. We can ensure that history records his actions not as crimes, but as heroism. We can place markers and plaques and memorials that tell his story to new generations. But recognition isn't enough. Samuel Burris's story calls us to something more. It calls us to recognize injustice in our own time, even when that injustice is legal, even when it's socially acceptable, even when challenging it comes with costs. The laws that nearly enslaved Samuel Burris were legal. They were enforced by courts and judges. They reflected the social order of their time, and they were profoundly, absolutely wrong. What laws in our own time will future generations look back on with horror? What injustices are we tolerating, participating in, failing to challenge? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions Samuel Burris's life forces us to confront. Because his story isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting our own choices, our own courage or lack thereof, our own willingness to risk something for what's right. Samuel Burris died in 1863, 50 years old, far from the Delaware countryside where he was born, far from the people he helped escape to freedom. He died before seeing slavery abolished, before knowing whether the war would end in Union victory or Confederate independence, before seeing whether the freedom he fought for would become law. But he died knowing he'd made a difference. He died knowing that he'd helped people escape bondage, that he'd risked everything for something that mattered, that he'd lived a life of purpose and courage. The freedom seekers he guided to Pennsylvania, the people he helped escape slavery, they lived. They had children. They built lives that wouldn't have been possible without his help. And their descendants are alive today because Samuel Burris was willing to risk his own freedom for theirs. That legacy can't be measured, can't be quantified. It ripples forward through generations, an echo of courage that never quite fades. We remember Samuel Burris not because he was perfect, not because his story is simple or uncomplicated, but because he represents something essential about the struggle for freedom. He represents the ordinary people who did extraordinary things. He represents the risks that real resistance requires. He represents the courage it takes to stand against injustice even when the cost is almost unbearable. And he represents a truth that's easy to forget. Freedom isn't free. It never has been. It's purchased with courage, sustained by sacrifice, defended by people willing to risk everything. Samuel Burris understood that. He lived it. And the freedom we enjoy today exists in part because people like him were willing to pay its price. His grave at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in California is marked now, recognized finally as the resting place of a hero. The old state house in Dover has exhibits about his trial and near enslavement. There are markers and memorials scattered across Delaware telling pieces of his story. But the real memorial to Samuel Burris isn't in stone or bronze. It's in the lives of the people he helped save, in the descendants of those freedom seekers, in the tradition of resistance he embodied. It's in every person who risks something to help someone else to freedom, who stands up against injustice even at personal cost, who believes that some things matter more than safety, that some causes are worth the risk. That's Samuel Burris's legacy. Not just what he did, but what he reminds us is possible, what he challenges us to be, what he demands we remember about the true cost of freedom and the courage required to defend it.